Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this talk this morning by Professor Jane Francis. I'm just going to wait a minute or two. I can see the participant numbers are rising. We actually have almost 300 people registered for today's talk, so just give all of those people a moment to join us. I think we'll just give it another 30 seconds to see if we're going to have a few more people joining us. As we know, sometimes when you join a Zoom meeting, your computer decides to crash or boots you out. So we'll just give people a moment longer. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this talk by Professor Jane Francis as part of our Extreme Antarctica series for the Cambridge Festival. Before I introduce you to Jane, I'll just run through the schedule for this morning. So Jane will talk for about 30 minutes about why the polar regions are important. And then we've got time for a Q&A at the end. And thank you to those of you who've already submitted your questions. We'll try and answer as many of those as we can. This session is being recorded. So if there are colleagues or members of your family that wanted to watch and couldn't, please be assured that we will post this on the website, the web page where you registered as quickly as we can to watch on demand. Please send in your questions. This is your opportunity to talk to our director, and we will be wrapping up at about 10 to 12. So there's plenty of time for questions at the end. So Professor Jane Francis joined the British Antarctic Survey as our director in 2013. She's the first woman director that we've had at the survey, and she's really championed the way for women working in polar science. She's a geologist by training and has worked all over the world, living in tents to research stations, looking at Antarctica's deep past when it was covered in a tropical rainforest and dinosaurs. And she's going to take you on a bit of a geological journey through time, through her specific area of work to the work that we're doing today. So without further ado, over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Athena. Let me just share my screen so that you can see my slides. There we go. So thank you. Yes, so as Athena said, I'm going to take you on a trip to Antarctica. So here's a satellite image of Antarctica now. I'm going to show you a very different one in a moment, but here's a nice satellite image, and you can see that Antarctica is mostly covered with thick ice sheets, up to 4 kilometers thick in places. And, you know, if all that ice melted, particularly in future, then we would raise global sea levels by 60 meters. So I'll show you a little bit later what the impact of that would be. But Antarctica's got lots of hidden secrets. Oops, I'm just trying to go forward. There we go. And so although this is the Antarctica that we all see now, and it is a truly beautiful place to go to. You can see these wonderful icebergs, the blue, this amazing blue color, which is I've tried to capture in my bathroom, but it's just impossible. But the rocks in Antarctica contain a fantastic history of what the continent was like in the past. But this is what it's like now. So here's one of my field camps on an island called Seymour Island, which is in Antarctica. And actually for geologists, this is hopeless, because geologists need to see rocks and fossils. And when you're in the tent and everything around you is covered in snow, you can't do any work. So this is the kind of tents we use, very much like Scott used, and all our boxes of food and medical equipment and geological equipment around us. And there's just 2 of us in this tent, eating a lot of food, listening to music, playing card games, and waiting for a couple of days, waiting for the snow to melt. But it is a fantastic place to work. But you know, Antarctica was not always covered in ice and snow. It didn't always look like the place that we see today, because millions of years ago, particularly the time of the dinosaurs, that's when I'll be going back to, the Antarctic continent was covered in forests. And the reason why a lot of us who've studied the fossil plants and the fossils of Antarctica is to understand what the climate was like in the past. And what does that tell us about Antarctica in our future warm world? So although you see that satellite image, and it is covered in ice and snow, it's about 99.9% covered in ice and snow. There are rocks that stick up through the surface. So you may be able to see my pointer here. These are the Transantarctic Mountains, and the mountain tops stick up above the ice. And some of the areas here on the Antarctic Peninsula, this thumb-like projection that points towards South America, there are islands at the tip that don't have any ice on them. And there are lots of areas around the coastline of Antarctica that have rocks exposed. And actually, do you know, the most common fossil, I think, I'm a bit biased, but I think the most common fossil is actually fossil plants. And where there are rocks exposed, fossil plants, leaves, and particularly fossil tree trunks are quite common. And that's because many of the rock sequences on Antarctica were once laid down on land. So they represent land conditions with forests on them. Now, this is a map that geologists have compiled. It's the whole Earth. So it's like the whole Earth stretched out. And that shows you the position of the continents in the past that geologists have worked out. So this is the time of the dinosaurs, about 100 million years ago. And you can just about recognize all the continents that you're familiar with today. But the really important thing to take home about this is that here's Antarctica, sort of spread out on the bottom of this projection. But Antarctica was a continent over the South Pole 100 million years ago. So when I show you pictures of dinosaurs and forests in Antarctica, I really am talking about animals and plants that lived on the South Pole, because people often say to me, oh, well, if it was warm, that means Antarctica was at the equator. But we know from geological evidence that Antarctica was actually at the South Pole, and it was actually connected to South America at that time, although it doesn't show it very clearly here. And it was connected to Australia, forming the continent of Gondwana. So Antarctica was warm because carbon dioxide levels were probably much higher. We think the carbon dioxide levels were over 1,000 parts per million, but clearly Antarctica was warm because even though it was over the South Pole. And this is what the place that I work in, mostly called Seymour Island on that Antarctic Peninsula that sticks up towards South America. And you can see it looks a bit like the Sahara. It actually is, these are the rocks of 100 million to 70 million years old. And we do find the bones of dinosaurs in here. We also find a lot of other kind of fossils that I'll show you. You might just be able to see where my arrow is, little orange splodges here. And that's our tent, that's our camp several miles away. So we've worked all across these sediments here and these rock sequences. And you can see this picture of me here holding this fabulous ammonite fossil, which shows what life was like millions of years ago. So here's a few of them. You can see here things that are, there's some bivalves here, some mollusks, some clams, ammonite. So here's a lovely ammonite down here. And then here are some gastropods that lived in the seas. So this was an ancient seaway at that time. This is about 70 million years ago, again, with dinosaurs around. And you can see this beautiful shiny shell on here. And one of the things that geologists can do, they can do chemistry on this shelly material. This is the original shelly material of these gastropods, these snails. We can flake off bits of this shell and we can analyze them to work out what the temperature of the seawater was in which these creatures lived. And basically we find that the waters were really warm at that time, about sort of 15 degrees centigrade. So it was quite a nice place to live. So I work with artists to try and bring to life the Antarctic of the past by putting together all of the geological evidence that we find. And I have an amazing time when I can try and take that picture that I've reconstructed from the fossils and rocks that's in my head and communicate it to the artist, who then paints it. So this artist is called Robert Nichols. He's famous for painting dinosaurs. So here's what we think the Antarctic seas looked like about 70 million years ago. So here's a large mosasaur, about the size of a double-decker bus. He's eating a primitive shark. So we see sort of remains of sharks in our fossil collections. Here's ammonites living in the water column, bobbing up and down in the water. We find a lot of fish fossils. We find plesiosaur fossils down here, these marine reptiles. We find seabirds, so we find bones of birds in these sediments. And this is a land dinosaur that has sort of lived on the land and has floated out to sea. He's a bit bloated and is about to become a meal for sharks. And there's the Antarctic Peninsula in the background, which we think at that time may have looked a bit like the Andes with volcanic peaks. And then you can see here covered in forests. So the fossils I've just showed you are the fossils that were of animals that lived here in this ocean. But I'm also going to show you fossils of the plants that lived on these mountains that then drifted out into the oceans. And they're preserved too in the ocean sediments, but they're beautiful. So we get things like this leaf here. So here's an impression of a small leaf, about 2 centimeters long, with these very, very strong veins. So we can identify that as a southern beech, a member of a family that lives in the southern hemisphere today. This is about 1 meter long. So there's large pieces of petrified wood. They're turned to stone and they represent large forest trees that drifted out from those forests into the oceans and then been petrified. And then we find all these tiny little things here. So these are less than 1 millimeter. These are all the spore and pollen from all the plants that lived on the Antarctic Peninsula millions of years ago. And these are really important because they help us date the age of the sediments, but they also help us identify the types of plants that lived in Antarctica at that time. And when we put all that evidence together, we again can paint another picture. So again, this is Bob Nichols, who's worked with me, and a PhD student called Jodie Howe. She went into the field to a particular island called Alexander Island, and she mapped out the fossil remains of this forest. So this is the best reconstruction of a fossil forest in Antarctica, I think, that you'll ever see, because this is actually the data that Jodie collected. So here you can see the trunk and the leaves of ginkgo, which I'm sure you see around today in parks and on streets. They were very common in the past. They really are trees from the age of the dinosaurs. So here's another one here. This is a southern hemisphere conifer called a podocarp. And then we had lots of monkey puzzle trees. So here you can see monkey puzzle trees, and we find the wood and the cones and the leaves of monkey puzzle trees in Antarctica. And again, they were very common in the time of the dinosaurs. We also find these tree ferns, sort of the kind of things that you can get in New Zealand and Tasmania today. Some of these plants here have gone extinct, so we don't quite know how they lived, but we do know there's lots of ferns down here, a few mosses and liverworts. But what we don't have in this particular forest are any flowering plants, because 100 million years ago, flowering plants were just about evolving in and appearing in Antarctica, but there weren't many in this forest. Now we do have actually a dinosaur here, And there he is hiding behind the tree. We haven't yet found the bones of this dinosaur in this particular forest, but I'm sure he would have wandered around here, because we do know that this dinosaur lived on the other parts of the peninsula up here. So this is a sort of a big turkey-sized like dinosaur that ate all the vegetation around here. And this kind of dinosaur was able to live all the way across Gondwana. So you find the same fossils in Australia and on other continents. So there were animals living in these forests. Now, this is another reconstruction by artist James Mackay. And this is a bit younger. So this is 70 million years ago. So again, this is the time of the dinosaurs. They were still alive. And so we have a lot of dinosaurs in this reconstruction. So you can see here, here you can see mountains that look like the Andes or like New Zealand today. These are monkey puzzle trees that live high on the mountainsides where they live today. So if you go to Chile, you can see monkey puzzle trees high up in the mountains. And then these trees here are the southern beech trees. They're called Nothofagus is their Latin name. And we even had, you see there's some red blobs here. So we know that there were flowers around. These are proteas. So they're a kind of flower that lives in the southern hemisphere today. There's these tree ferns. There's sort of kind of water lily-like plants. Gunnera, if you go to botanical gardens, you'll see great big leaves that look like a dinosaur kind of plant. We had them in Antarctica. And then you can see all the animals around here. So my Argentinian and American colleagues work on the bones that we found in our rock sequences. And they found evidence of sauropods. We even see the footprints of sauropods in some of the rock sequences. There's some hadrosaurs here, you can see. We've got fossils of those. There's a stegosaurus type dinosaur here. There's some sort of feathered dinosaurs here, the avian type dinosaurs. And then we even see, look, there's some ducks here as well. So we even have fossil bones of ducks in Antarctica, along with the dinosaurs. So it was a pretty fertile and green land. And if there was any sign of ice, it would have been really over the South Pole at that time. Now, as we go forward in time, here's another reconstruction by colleagues from the American Museum of Natural History who've worked there. They've also worked on bones. And Jane, this is it, their reconstruction.
Jane, yes? Sorry, just to interrupt, there's a little bit of a time lag with your slides and what you're saying. So if you could just spend a little bit longer explaining the slides, because it's just taking, we've just got to the next slide now. So brilliant.
Oh, right.
It's a little bit of a time lag. Thanks.
So let me know if I'm going too fast again, Athena, so I get a sense of the timing. Okay. So this is a picture 50 million years ago. So the dinosaurs died out mostly on Earth around or the non-avian dinosaurs, I should say. So the dinosaurs that had no connection to modern birds, they died out about 66 million years ago. And instead, this was the rise of the mammals. And so the American colleagues have found the bones of the possums here. There's a kind of marsupial-like possum that lived in Antarctica. Here you see she is sitting on Nothofagus, so southern beech was still growing there. These are plants called Winteraceae. They grow in the southern hemisphere today. Here's the monkey puzzle trees. They were still around. So although the dinosaurs died out in Antarctica, we don't seem to have much of an impact on the vegetation. And the vegetation is very much like the kind of vegetation that lives in Antarctica today. Sorry, in the southern hemisphere, in Australia, in Tasmania, in New Zealand today. So they also find, here you can see my pointers pointing to, this is a big carnivorous bird that they found the bones of, and this kind of fossil ungulate that's probably a bit extinct now, but must have been ancestor of something like a llama or a kind of horse. And I have to say, while we're on this picture, they've also put these little blobs on the beach down here, and these are penguins. So when we look at the rock sequence and we look for these fossil plants, we also find the bones of penguins right next to the leaves. So penguins evolved in Antarctica when the climate was much warmer. So Athena, can you tell me when this next slide appears, which is an ocean map?
Not yet, not yet. It'll take
no?
Okay, it's come through now.
Okay, so it's quite a delay. So those fossil plants continued in Antarctica from the time of the dinosaurs, past the time of the dinosaurs to the time of the mammals, until about 40 million years ago. And on Antarctica, geologists have found the first signs of ice sheets on Antarctica 40 million years ago. So that's quite a long time. And they see sort of the rock record of ice. And what we know then happened is carbon dioxide levels were decreasing, but also there were major tectonic movements that isolated Antarctica, and then it became really much colder. So on this map, you can see that at this point, this is about 20 million years ago, ice had formed in Antarctica, but it was isolated from all the other continents. So Gondwana had broken up. There was an ocean between all the other continents in the southern hemisphere, and Antarctica was isolated in this sort of current that was able to flow around Antarctica without being disturbed by any continental mass. And that trapped Antarctica in an icy, cold Antarctic circumpolar current. And from then on, Antarctica really did start to get very, very cold. But although it did get cold, although there were huge ice sheets on Antarctica, they came and they went. And we still find evidence of fossil plants in Antarctica, even when there was ice on Antarctica. So this next slide, which I hope you can see yet. Athena, are we on the next slide?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So I think I know how long it's going to take now. So we find these tiny fossils in rocks that tell us there was ice on Antarctica. But you can see I'm holding here this tiny, tiny twig. And we also find these leaves, which you can see are leaves that you've seen before. These are the leaves of southern beech. So, but these are only about 10 million years old. So 10 million years ago, there were plants in Antarctica, but they were growing right at the edge of glaciers. And this tiny little twig here, if I cut it open, you'd see probably 100 tree rings in it. So this was a tiny twig that was growing really, really slowly in very cold frozen environments. And it was just in tundra environments. But that really was the last time that Antarctica had vegetation before the great ice sheets spread in. So about 5 million years ago, then what I call the ice house set in, and very large ice sheets grew across Antarctica, covered the whole continent. And we're in what we call now the ice age that we know so well. So Antarctica became that sort of icy, cold land with very little life on it. So the big question that we're asking today is, ironically, we're sort of going backwards now because our climate is warming again in current days. So we're asking the question, what is the fate of the Antarctic ice sheets now that our climate is warming again? So I've just showed you what it was like when it was super warm. And the question really is, can we use that as a signal to tell us how Antarctica is warming now and where our future might lie? It might not be as extreme as forests, but certainly Antarctica is warming up. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the research that we're doing today to try and understand what is happening to those ice sheets and how the warmth is affecting them. So can you see the next slide of Roderick yet, Athena?
Yes, just come through.
So this is a picture of the Antarctic Peninsula today. No forests, plenty of ice sheets. And you can see in the square below, I've just highlighted one of our research stations Rothera research station. So Rothera is our main hub in Antarctica. This is where we fly to from Chile, and you can see the long thin shape down here, which is the runway. So this is where scientists come to when they do research in Antarctica, and they either do research in Rothera Station, or they will fly out in our Twin Otter aircraft into the main continent to do research across the continent, mainly on ice sheets, on the rocks, in the oceans, and on the land, and animals in the land and in the oceans. And this is our main hub. This is where a lot of work gets done. And I just want to show you some pictures of certainly this picture, which can you see this now, of the Discovery Building, Athena?
Yes, it's on screen.
So this is our new building that we're building in Antarctica at the moment. So this is going to be state-of-the-art science support labs. So in there you can see places where scientists will go before they go into the field. We'll do all the preparation here. There's offices in there for scientists. There's garages where we prepare all our kit for going in the field, a medical center, generators, and you can see the tower there where we look for the aircraft coming in. And it's all tried to be sustainable now. So we're looking at our carbon balance, and there's a lot of solar panels on the building, and as much as we can do to save energy. So here's one of the things. We're now on a slide, I hope you can see, ice core drilling for ice sheet history. So one of the things we need to know is about the history of the ice sheet and how it built up from the time that I showed you in my slides before about the geology. How did the ice sheet build up? What can it tell us about its links with climate? And then that can tell us how climate in the future, as it warms, is going to affect the ice sheet. So I hope you can see this picture now, Athena, of one of our scientists drilling for ice. Are you there, Athena? Are we? We're
in the tent.
So you can see here, this is Rob Mulvaney, one of our ice drillers, and he has his hands on the ice corer. So that drills down into the ice sheet, and he can get an ice core out that sometimes goes back to 800,000 years in age. The ice comes out, you can see here on the right-hand side, in these slabs or cores of ice, which the scientists cut into meter lengths, and they put them into these big white boxes that are under the bench here on the right, and they take them back to the lab where they analyze the ice. And you can see a big saw here, which they cut them with. So I need to get to the next slide before I start talking. So when we get to the ice core slice, Athena, can you let me know? So what the scientists do is they cut the ice into very thin slices. They can date the slices of ice, and the ice contains remnants of air that fell on Earth thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago.
The slide is there, Jane.
Thank you. So you can see that slice of ice there. And can you see that inside the ice, there are these tiny little bubbles? And these bubbles are absolutely critical for telling us about the ice history and climate history. And that inside those bubbles, there are the ancient air that was on the Earth when the ice was formed, and the snow fell, it was then compressed into the ice. And the air in those bubbles is the real air. It's not a proxy, it's not a replica, it's the real air that was on Earth thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago. So what the scientists can do is that they crack open the ice, they melt it, they can capture the air inside these bubbles, and they can measure the carbon dioxide level in the ice. And what they find is that the air up to 800,000 years ago, the time when there are ice sheets on Earth, the carbon dioxide levels on Earth never went above 300 parts per million. Now we know that our carbon dioxide level on Earth today is 400 parts per million. And so we are way, way, way above the carbon dioxide levels of an ice age. So our Earth today is trying to catch up to be a 400 parts per million world. So we know that in the past, carbon dioxide levels were lower when there was ice on Earth, and the ice was balanced at that 300 parts per million carbon dioxide world. So what are we doing today? We do know also that the warming world is warming the ocean waters, and those ocean waters are also warming the edges of these ice sheets and ice shelves. So when a glacier comes off the land and it hits the ocean in Antarctica, it floats as an ice shelf. And what we think is happening is that the warm water is coming underneath the ice shelf and melting the ice shelf from below. And that has really important consequences for the whole of the ice on Antarctica. So my next slide, which Athena will tell me when we can see, is of a satellite image of Antarctica.
It's up,
Thank you. Okay. Which shows you where the Antarctic ice sheet is warming. So on this map, satellite image, you can see some red blobs, particularly here on this sort of western side. This area, this kind of thumb-shaped part of the ice sheet is called the West Antarctic ice sheet. And you can see the main part of Antarctica, this bigger part over here, is called the East Antarctic ice sheet. The East Antarctic ice sheet mainly sits on rock. So if you drill down, you would find rock. The West Antarctic ice sheet, actually, a lot of it is not on rock. It's below sea level. And this is really important because it makes it less stable than if it was sitting on rock. And so this whole of this West Antarctic ice sheet contains about 6 meters equivalent of global sea level rise. So we have a big project to look at this ice. So 6 meters sea level rise for the West Antarctic ice sheet. But if all of the ice sheet of Antarctica melted, the sea levels of the world would rise by about 60 meters. I mean, and if Antarctica was free of ice, that means the rest of the world would be free of ice as well. So this next diagram, can you see it yet on top, Athena?
Yeah. Yes, it's up.
This is a National Geographic map, which shows what would happen if there was no ice on Earth. And if this is a map of Europe, and you can see that actually most of the major cities disappear. So London's will be underwater, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Venice. So it would have a very drastic effect on, particularly on Europe and where we're familiar with. A lot of the coastal lowland areas would be submerged in seawater. And of course, this has huge impact, not only on us in the UK, but also around the world where the huge populations live. And of course, where all the major cities are historically on the coastline. So this really is quite an important link that Antarctica has to the rest of the world. So this next slide, can you see this yet?
Yeah, it's come through.
Yep. Is another fascinating satellite image that's colored. This is from NASA, false colored, and it shows, what it really shows is the speed of the ice. But you can see it's represented in these amazing structures. So these like tree-like structures are coming off. These are glaciers that are streaming off the ice sheet. And then as the ice reaches the sea, it forms these purple areas, which are the ice shelves floating on the ocean. And the really important thing is that these shelves, the purple areas, are keeping the glaciers back on the land. They act as a kind of buttress or a doorstop to stop the glacial ice, the fresh water in the glaciers coming down and reaching the ocean and then melting. And so we really want to make sure that these ice shelves are stable so that they keep all the rest of the ice and the water, the frozen water, on land. And we're looking at we have a big project where this star is, which is called the Thwaites Glacier Project, which I'm going to show you, which is looking at how warm water is affecting this glacier. It's quite a small one in a way. The ice shelf here is small, but behind it, this area below sea level of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And so what we're worried about is whether the warm water is going to get underneath this ice shelf and melt the heart out of the West Antarctic ice sheet and therefore really accelerate the melting of the whole of this area in the West Antarctica. So we have a new project which is funded by the UK and by America, and we have big teams doing one of the most ambitious field projects in Antarctica to look at how this warm water is affecting the Thwaites glacier. Are we there yet, Athena?
Yep, the slide is live. Yep.
Yep. So we've done some work. So here we are. Here's Thwaites glacier. Here's the ice shelf floating down on the ocean, cracking up naturally into icebergs. So we've had ships here which have deployed instruments to measure the temperature of the water. They put in these things called moorings to measure all the different properties of the ocean. But they've also launched these little submarines here, these little robotic submarines called AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles. And they've been going right underneath the ice shelf to see what's happening underneath the ice shelf. And in particular, they're very interested in what's happening in this point here called the grounding zone, which is where the glacier hits the rock. And at the moment that keeps it stable. But if the warm water comes under here and melts the glacier here, the glacier will then start floating, and the warm water will be able to get underneath there and go inland and melt the ice even more, and probably quite quickly. So you can see we have this huge project using satellites, using geologists camping on rocks, people in the aircraft taking surveys, people camping on the ice, measuring what's going on the glacier to try and understand what's happening to the Thwaites glacier and what's going to happen, and try and predict, working with modelers, the fate of the Thwaites glacier and the West Antarctic ice sheet in the future. Now I'll just talk a little bit about the ocean, because the ocean is really important, and Athena will tell me when I'm on to the next slide. But
it's live, Jane.
Okay, thank you. The ocean actually is a major conveyor. We call this the global conveyor. It particularly takes water around Antarctica, which is cold and dense and salty, and it flows all the way along the bottom of the global ocean, and then it interacts with other currents which are much warmer. And this is the ocean conveyor that transports heat around the ocean, so it's very important. And so studying the ocean, and particularly the ocean around Antarctica, is quite critical for understanding how global warming is affecting us. So here's a picture of our new ship, the Sir David Attenborough, which I'm sure you've all heard about in the news. So this is a magnificent new ship, an icebreaker, to take scientists to Antarctica to do new science, all kinds of science, to try and understand what's happening in the oceans. So the ship is currently around the UK, so you may have seen it in the news. It's just testing all its systems, and it will be going to Antarctica in November to do some, to supply all the stations, and then it will be testing the science equipment and eventually doing some science. And what we found so far, actually, from past expeditions to the ocean, is that the ocean is really important, particularly this ocean around Antarctica. It draws down carbon dioxide and it draws down heat into the ocean. So some of the man-made heat caused by global warming is going down into this ocean and being stored in the ocean, and as is carbon dioxide. But we don't yet know enough about what actually is happening to that heat, where it's going and where the carbon dioxide is going, and what will happen in future. So working on ships and looking at oceans, the oceans, is really important for the science that we're doing to understand future global warming and the impact on the rest of the world. So global warming is also impacting on the Antarctic animals. So I couldn't really give a talk about Antarctica without showing you some of the great animals and plants that live there. Can you see that, Athena?
Yes, we can.
So you can see we do a lot of work in the British Antarctic Survey on all the animals around there. They mostly live actually in the sub-Antarctic. So we do have lots of penguins in Antarctica on the ice, as I'm sure you know. In the oceans, even though they're really cold, there is an amazing abundance of life in the oceans, particularly adapted to living in the cold. So we have fish that don't have red blood cells. They have antifreeze in their bodies to stop freezing. There is amazing plants on land. And of course, we've got elephant seals there, other seals and whales in the ocean, as well as the albatross. But most importantly, in the center, you can see krill, which are a really critical part of the food chain that feeds a lot of these animals. And if the climate changes, if the ice melts, then this will have an impact on the krill, and then there will be an impact on the food chain all the way up to the sort of really iconic animals in whales and the albatross in Antarctica. So this picture here, which I hope you're at now, is actually of the subantarctic around South Georgia. So it's a little bit warmer, as you can see, because there's lots of grass around. And you can see in the far side of that bay, this is our research station called Bird Island. And this is where albatross live. So when you see David Attenborough on TV sitting with albatross, he's mostly sitting around here in Bird Island with the albatross here. And the albatross are, they breed here. You can see the chick here poking out of the nest. The albatross are very precious in Antarctica. They're really iconic bird, and we're studying the albatross to understand how they are being affected by global warming. So finally, my final slide, are we there yet, Athena? Is 3 parts.
Not yet, still on the albatrosses.
Oh good, they're worth looking at for a long time.
You've got your final slide, Jane.
So I've showed you from the geological point of view, the history of Antarctica when it was the time of the dinosaurs, when it was over the South Pole, when it was covered in forests, but very, very warm. But then carbon dioxide levels of the world dropped, Antarctica cooled, we had tundra-like conditions and the ice sheets grew. And then finally, we're at the kind of Antarctica that we see on the right-hand side today, with covered in ice sheets. But we know they're beginning to melt. So the big question really that I'll leave you with is, are we going back in time like this to tundra and to forest back in Antarctica? Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that insightful talk and taking us all on a journey through geological time. And thank you to everybody who has joined us today. We have people from over 20 countries, and we have quite a few questions that have come in. So I'll get straight on to those. Some of these questions are similar, so I'll try to group them. So we have a question from Maverick Piccinini from the UK. How is autonomous technology helping operations for British Antarctic Survey?
Oh, I think it's the way forward. A lot of this autonomous work, particularly off the ship. So this is David Attenborough. We would like to call that the mothership, and that we'll use autonomous vehicles from it. It will help us collect a lot more data from places we can't go. I mean, if you take the Thwaites project particularly, nobody ever has been underneath an ice shelf. We didn't know what was living underneath an ice shelf, but actually the autonomous vehicles that have gone underneath there have been able to record conditions underneath the ice shelf. They've had cameras on them, so we can see that there are animals that live a long way underneath the ice shelf, long way from light and from what we think is their food source. So we're seeing into new worlds that we've never seen before. It's also helping us with our carbon. So we're very conscious of our carbon balance. And it means that we can send the autonomous vehicles off, and we can keep the ship still and not burn fuel. So they're going to be extremely important in the future.
Okay, so we have a question from Thomas Oates, who is a first-year mature marine biology student who wants to work for British Antarctic Survey. So he says, have you got any advice? And it might be nice to just touch upon, if somebody did want to work for us, what could they do?
So if you want to be a scientist to work for BAS, I think that yes, so you need to get a really good science background in any field, actually. So we take most fields across the whole range of science, you know, climate, geology, ice, oceans, the whole ecosystems, biology, the whole range. It's good to get a good higher qualifications, go to university. You can do a PhD, a research project with a university linked to BAS. And then from time to time, we do have jobs available to be a scientist on projects, and they're all advertised mainly on the BAS website and in other places. So you do need a really good, sound science career. We do also employ people to run our stations. So we have mountaineers, we have chefs, we have plumbers, mechanics, you name it, we employ people to run the stations as well. So we have a huge diverse work team, pilots, mariners on the ships, you name it, we employ them.
I would echo that. If you want to work for us in Antarctica, there's a whole range of jobs. You don't just need to be a scientist, because we do need people to keep the lights on, drive the boats, look after everyone in terms of doctors. So we take all sorts, and that's what makes it a really special place, is that you have a really good mix of people.
And people who work in communications teams like Athena as well.
Yeah, so I have a public relations background, and I joined 20 years ago thinking I would stay for a couple of years, and I'm still here because I feel now that the polar regions and communicating what we're doing is more important than ever, and activities like this. So, okay, let's go through to another question. So we have a question from Australia, from Anne-Marie Tossolini. What is your most exciting fossil find?
Anne-Marie used to work for me. So Anne-Marie is, hello Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie is a scientist who studied fossil plants, and we worked together in Antarctica. So, what's my fossil? Oh, it's got to be, Anne-Marie, is some of those leaves that we found in Antarctica. It is quite an amazing thing, you know, to go to Antarctica, covered in ice, covered in snow, and then when you find a piece of rock and you hit it with a hammer, open it up, and you find a leaf fossil. I mean, it is such a paradox. It's such a contrast. And Anne-Marie works on the fossil leaves particularly, and has published lots of papers on this. So, and Anne-Marie is helping to build up a picture of what Antarctica was like in the past, and some of her work is in what I was mentioning in there. So yeah, I'm sure Anne-Marie would say the same thing, wouldn't you, Anne-Marie?
So we have a question from India, Rahul Mohan. So we've talked a lot about West Antarctica, but his question is, what do you foresee for East Antarctic ice sheets in a climate change scenario?
Hi Rahul. So East Antarctica is actually, I think, going to be one of the topics that will be worked on a lot by scientists in the future, because at the moment, people think that actually, because it's based on rock, we can't get that kind of warming from the oceans at the edge of the continent. Although there are a few places where there are these big basins underneath the edges of the East Antarctic ice sheet, which are beginning, I think, to show, or scientists think that are beginning to show evidence of the warm waters affecting them. And also a bit like Greenland, in that as our climate warms, it may be that the ice sheet starts warming from the top, and then water will start flowing from the top, and we'll be thinning the ice sheet, and then it'll be a different kind of warming and a different kind of impact. But I think that's to come, and I think that's where the next big area of Antarctic science might well be.
So we have a question from Swati Nagar. I don't have a note of where she's from, but I know we have a lot of different countries joining us. So she said, what is your opinion on the role and contribution of women in polar science and policy?
Absolutely critical. I mean, women and men and whoever, you know, I think we need as diverse a workforce as possible in Antarctica, and there's no reason why women can't work in Antarctica. I've worked in the Arctic and Antarctica, and I've really enjoyed it. And, you know, I've worked in mixed teams. There's no need to have single teams. And I think women have as much or more to contribute than anyone else, than men. So I think if you want to do science, just go for it and enjoy being in the continent.
Okay, so many questions are coming in. So just have a look at some that have come in the last few minutes. So how was the iceberg A68, which of course has been in the media quite a lot, able to break away from Antarctica? And why were there concerns about it grounding on South Georgia?
So often a lot of the icebergs that form in Antarctica are quite natural. So you can imagine as the ice comes off the glacier, off land, and then it floats onto the ocean. So that was the Larsen ice shelf. it gets too big, heavy. We don't know whether climate warming is involved, but it is a natural process. And as the iceberg breaks off and then it floats north following the currents, this current was called the iceberg alley, where all the icebergs go. And it was flowing, it was very big. I mean, it was bigger than South Georgia itself, which was quite staggering. And there was worry that it actually would ground on the continental shelf. And when it does so, it has quite dramatic effects. One of them is that, you know, the iceberg is just a huge store of fresh water. And as it begins to melt in those warmer waters, it does change the chemistry of the ocean and it impacts on the food cycle of all the creatures in the ocean that ultimately affects all the sort of the food web and the large, you know, there's millions of penguins and seals and whales that live around South Georgia. So it is an ecosystem hotspot. And if we had a large iceberg like that, it really would profoundly affect what the ocean composition. And it would also actually just physically block some of the pathways of some of the animals that are feeding there. I mean, it's broken up now. There's still some very large pieces around South Georgia. So we're waiting to see what's going to happen to them and whether they will actually also ground on the ice sheet. But quite a lot of it is now moved away and will soon melt.
And a lot of our colleagues at the survey track icebergs from space. And we do work with, you know, maritime industries to help them with iceberg tracking and things like that. So quite a lot of the science we do also helps business and, you know, other organizations as well. We've had a couple of questions about the Thwaites glacier. One is from Martin Gray saying, being that warm water seems inevitable to get under Thwaites, what is the time scale for that plug going and an iceberg floating? And then another question, are there any solutions being developed to prevent Thwaites from breaking off? So if you could answer those, that'd be great.
So time span of when all this could happen, well, we don't really know. And that's what, you know, we really need to try and understand the system a lot better. There are a lot of this data that we collect is used by climate modelers and ice sheet modelers to try and understand what might happen and to try and to give us some indication of the timing. And the ones I've seen actually some fairly simple but quite important ice sheet models does suggest that once the water does get into the heart of the West Antarctic ice sheet, it could actually melt the ice sheet relatively rapidly. So, I mean, in geological timescales, I'm talking relatively rapidly, probably in hundreds of thousands of years, but you know, quicker than a sort of a natural process, a normal process that we're used to today. Sorry, what was the other bit of the question? That's right. Could it be stopped?
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's a lot of talk about geoengineering, and there are some people who have come up with ideas about how we could stop ice melting, how we could freeze the Arctic. But ultimately, what is causing global warming is carbon dioxide. And so the only way to stop global warming is to ensure that we either stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we also need to decrease the levels. So we need to think of some way of burying it. But I think any kind of things that we try to do to block out the sun or refreeze the ice isn't really going to work until we can control carbon dioxide.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's still lots of questions coming in. So I think if we could squeeze in two more, let's have a look. What other archives, apart from ice cores, do you guys collect for studying the past environments of Antarctica? And that's from Natalie Deng.
Oh, all sorts of things. I mean, we have huge data resources. I mean, as geologists and all kinds of people, we collect sediment cores off the ships, so we can look at the history of Antarctica from the ocean, everything from you know, how acidic the ocean has been. I mean, as we put more carbon dioxide into the ocean, it's becoming slightly more acidic. So there are scientists who look at how the acid in the more acidic water is dissolving shells or not. And so we can study the history of that. We look at records. We've got we collect records. We do particularly in the British Antarctic Survey, we do a lot of long-term monitoring. So we have a lot of instruments in Antarctica and people who collect data annually or even daily. We have divers that work all through the winter to collect ocean temperatures, ocean waters around Rothera. And they all add to these big data series so that over time we can see how things have changed. So that's how the ozone hole, for example, was discovered, by looking at these data series that were collected over many, many years. So we collect all kinds of data to try and understand how systems work, both in the past and in the present, and that helps us trying to predict what happens in the future.
Okay, so as we approach 12 o'clock, I'd like us just to answer one last question that came in from Mikio Naganobu. Apologies for my pronunciation, from Japan. What should be the basic philosophy and attitude of not only scientists, but also citizens regarding the environmental ecosystems?
Well, I think that we're absolutely critical. Isn't one of the things that we're learning now is that the environment is absolutely critical for our well-being and our survival, really, on this planet, and that in the past we may have been understood it less and haven't taken care of the environment as much as we should. And I think it's a lesson we are now learning, and hopefully in the future we will understand that we need to work in balance in a sustainable way with the environment and look after it a lot better than we have done in the past.
Many thanks, Jane, and many thanks to all of you for joining our talk today. I'm sorry we couldn't answer everybody's questions. There's still more coming in, but please go to our website. There's a huge amount of information on there about all the different research projects that we're doing. And if you still have a burning question, please contact us through the communications team. We have an email called information@bas.ac.uk. So do send in your questions and we can answer them after that. But otherwise, thanks to Jane, thank you to you. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and take care.